Welcome to Abiding Creatives Podcast, where we talk about art, faith, and caring for your creative soul. I'm Haley, an artist and writer learning to faithfully follow Jesus in my creative calling. And this is the podcast for all of us makers, dreamers, and ones created to create, who are ready to let go of striving and discover the joy and freedom of creating with Jesus. Welcome back to Abiding Creatives Podcast. Today I'm so excited to be talking to Katie Sampias, who's an author and faithful creative, and it's going to be such a wonderful conversation hearing her writing process and how she's learned to create with Jesus. Now, before we get into the episode, I want to invite you to like, share, and leave a comment on the podcast. It would mean so much to me if you could help me keep sharing this podcast with all the faithful creatives who need to hear it. Now let's get into the conversation. Well, I'm so excited to have Katie Sampias on the podcast today. Katie, why don't we have you share a little bit about who you are and your creative work?
Sure. So I live in Brisbane, Australia. I have 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, and I'm married to a beautiful man called Matt. I've been writing since I was a kid. I always loved the writing practice. So that's my creative practice. Interestingly, and maybe this is true of a lot of people, I cannot draw for the life of me. Like stick figures come out if I try to draw. So it's definitely the writing aspect that is the creative part of me. I probably first fell in love with writing when I was about in year 3. They gave us free writing time and everyone else would write like 1 or 2 sentences and I would write about 5 pages. So that's probably when I knew it was something inside of me that I really liked doing. And I got really into the stories that I was writing. I think at that time I liked combining different fairy tales and seeing where the story went. And it's always been inside of me. I had this sort of internal struggle when I was deciding what to do to go when I went to what Americans would say, go to college, because I thought, oh, I want to study writing. It was always there. But, financially, that's not necessarily the best move sometimes. So I ended up doing a different degree and getting a practical job. But I went back to study journalism when I was in my late 20s. And there I got to do some creative writing courses as part of my journalism course. If you describe my creative practice, I think there's 3 different types of writing I do. I do reflective pieces, I do historical fiction pieces, and I do fantasy pieces. And the book that I have had published by Calla Press is called Her Story of Jesus, and that's historical fiction based on the stories of the gospel, but written from the points of view of women. That's my first piece that's out there in the world, I guess, my first big piece. And that was launched in the middle of last year.
Yeah, that's so good. I can resonate with what you're saying growing up. I think I am both a writer and an artist, and I definitely sense this with writing, but specifically with art. Like whenever there was something having to do with art for, like a school project or something, I spent so much time on it. And so it's fun to see how those things that we are drawn to start when we're really young, and sometimes we have to come back to that after going through school and kind of choosing the more practical things, like being able to return to those creative gifts and how God brings us back to them. And your book is wonderful. I really want to talk about the writing process with you and how you felt God lead you through that writing process. It's such a wonderful thing to be able to create with God, but sometimes us creatives aren't so sure what that looks like. And so it's amazing just to hear from actual writers and creatives what their process with creating with Jesus looks like.
Maybe I didn't realize this at the beginning when I found my writing, that it's sort of a co-creative exercise with God. Like I think it's part of my prayer. I would get like these sort of fragments of images in my head or things happening in my head when I read different gospel passages. And I've always been like really interested in the details and minutiae of things and sort of have this investigative slant. Like I really wanted to know what happened. So when I'd read the Bible, I think everyone has a different experience reading the Bible. I would read a story and go, but what about this? Like, what about this? Like what happened here and what was this in relation like what happened just before this, and trying to fit it all into context. And sometimes if you get down to it and you really start thinking about it, there's not a lot of detail there. And I really wanted to know what happened in those stories. Um, but I wrote my first part of the book, was actually as an assignment as part of my creative writing course that I did when I was older. And
Mm.
I wrote the piece Pilot's Wife because I'd always been intrigued about this dream. Like that's another thing I'm sort of interested in is dreams and dream theories. I did a whole retreat once about dreams and what they could mean or how they can help
Mm.
you understand what's happening inside of you.
Yeah.
I was really interested in her dream and how it's even recorded that she had this dream and she talked to her husband and said, "Don't do anything with that man," which I found like it's just a really interesting detail that's in the Gospels.
Mhm.
So I explored how Pilate's wife would have been affected by seeing Jesus. I don't think she didn't speak to him, but she probably would have seen him from a distance. And I reflected on that and imagined the story from her perspective. So that was the first story I wrote. But it became apparent, I think during that time, I had different bits and pieces popping up from the wedding at Cana story that I started thinking about. It was all fragmented at first. And then I started writing it down. And over time, it became clear that I was to write the whole sort of chronology of Jesus's life, but from women's perspectives.
Mm.
It's something that kind of evolved over time. It became clear over time.
That's so interesting. Creating with God sometimes feel like it's a different timeline than ours.
Sometimes it's quite frustrating if you get a glimpse of something and then you don't know what's next that's going to happen in the story. My way of dealing with that, I guess, at a practical level was sort of just asking questions of God to tell me more
Mm.
about what he was trying to tell me in the story and then waiting for an answer. But it took me 12 years to write the book. It wasn't a
Mm.
quick process. It was something
Mhm.
over time. And there were periods where I was very frustrated because I couldn't write the book, even though there was periods when I didn't have a job and I had the time to write, but I couldn't do it. Like
Mhm.
I was blocked, but it probably wasn't the right time to write the piece. I hadn't learnt in life what I needed to know to write the piece.
Mm.
So it's just an evolutionary thing that happens sort of alongside my life.
I've had to learn to embrace that too with like different projects that I know he's placed on my heart, but sometimes for one reason or another, I just like don't have all the pieces or I don't have the inspiration or I just don't have the time. Yeah, there's a lot at play that we don't always understand. And I think it's also okay to embrace that and not like shame ourselves for being like, oh, I can't get this done quick enough. It's beautiful what you did right and just seeing how it eventually came together. That seems like a divinely orchestrated sort of thing that you couldn't have done on your own or in your own strength fully. So I think that's super cool. And I know you mentioned this idea of imaginative prayer, and I'm just curious if you could share a little bit more about that. If people who are listening maybe are curious about it, haven't heard about it before, what drew you to incorporating that into your creativity and how did you discover it?
I probably knew about imaginative prayer from when I was really little, just because I was introduced to it through my parents' spirituality. It's essentially just putting yourself in the Bible story and imagining yourself there, and then immersing yourself in it and seeing what happens in your imagination and then bringing that to prayer to see what God's telling you through that. So I use that, but mine I coined, I think in my introduction, I talk about mine's a little bit more specific because mine's very into the details. So investigative, imaginative prayer, I call it.
Mhm, mhm,
Whereas you can do imaginative prayer and you might just do it for 2 minutes and think you're in the Bible story. And the thing that might stand out to you is that you're a specific character in the story when you imagine, and that might be telling you something about what is happening in your current life because you appear as that person in the story. I use that background to write this book. And I think in my introduction also I talk about where I first used imaginative prayers in my childhood, imagining Jesus being with me in a situation at school that I wasn't comfortable with. So that's
mhm,
where I first sort of got introduced to the idea about it. Being a very imaginative person, it's a useful tool for me because it's kind of like play. So, I think sometimes with traditional praying, you can think it's really boring and rote or bland, but this for me is a very rich way of praying and playful way of engaging with God. Where did you find imaginative prayer? How did you come across it?
Well, I kind of fell into it back like in 2020. I had just this wilderness season of feeling far from God and also at the same time really wanting to feel close to Him and just feeling really done with the striving sort of performative nature of the other ways that I've kind of been familiar with connecting with him, honestly, even in prayer, just it being about talking and asking things. I kind of got fed up with it. So I started to explore template of prayer of just kind of waiting for his presence. And I would see images of Jesus, images kind of pertaining to what I was going through and often very symbolic. And so I'd write them down. And so as I slowly started to research, like, what is this? I started to understand, like, oh, God speaks through images to some of us. And then it became more of like a dialogue, and I would ask him to show me things. And sometimes it would be more of like a scene or something. And so it kind of just became this thing that as I was starting to create, I would ask him to show me kind of what he wanted to create that day. And then a couple years later, I had a small group leader who knew the Ignatius imaginative prayer. And so she was like, oh, let's do this exercise. And so we imagined being in like one of Jesus's parables. And I was like, oh, I've been doing this. I didn't realize that this was a thing. And so it's just funny. I feel like God, in his own ways, brings us to the same point. And it really opened up my eyes to just how creative he is. And it was this missing piece that I didn't know I was missing, you know?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I have had in my own recent experiences where I'm like, "Oh, I prayed like that." But actually people do, and it was put into words recently like that too. Um, I do these, they're breathwork sessions, but with Holy Spirit breathwork sessions that I've done on
Mm-hmm.
some recent retreats where I've got these really big like images in my head, and I didn't even know it until we had like the sharing after we had these exercises. But a lot of the images and imagery I got was actually biblical. There were verses in scripture that accorded with the image
Yeah.
I was
Mm-hmm.
seeing in my mind, so that was,
Mm-hmm.
like, revelatory to me as well.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I like imaginative prayer and the depth of message that you can get from it.
And I think it's interesting too, being able to use that or just knowing that God speaks that way when I'm praying for other people. Like that's a way of sort of sharing prophetic words. And I think that that's just something I kind of stumbled upon because I was like, I'm just tired of it feeling like I'm just talking to a wall. And
Mm,
so inviting God's presence in and like kind of learning to understand his silent sort of language is really
mm.
something that took both like our relationship to a different level of intimacy, but also sharpened my creative skills and then prophetic gifts. I think that that's something that I really want to give faithful creatives permission to do because sometimes, but depending on our backgrounds, we just don't realize that that maybe could be a way that God speaks to us and that we're allowed to, or that it's
Mm.
safe, you know? Talking about your book, I'm curious, is there anything that stands out to you that you learned about how Jesus treated and saw women that you didn't expect or that was different than before you started this project?
I think, from an intellectual level, I always knew that Jesus was different and Jesus loved women in a certain different way to how women were perceived at the time. But immersing myself in the experience allowed me to feel the depth of his love for women. And
Mm.
so I could feel it on a deeper level, like I was being loved in all those situations from the perspective of different periods of womanhood.
Mhm.
For example, like I'd go to write a piece and I'd experience something different to what I thought I was trying to convey in the first instance. And this is kind of related to the midwife story. I set out thinking that I really wanted to engage with the real physical reality of birth and how that is such a profound physical reality. But when I wrote the piece, there was more divine aspects that came into my imagination about what actually happened at the birth. So that was interesting to that the real supernatural side is what that midwife experienced in that story for me.
That's so interesting. There's something about creating with God that brings a different perspective. If it was just you creating, you're only seeing your perspective, but when you're bringing God into it, like he can show you things that you just didn't expect and takes it into a different direction that can just be so much more revelatory for people, for you, even as the creative.
Things happen in your creative process that you don't expect. It has to be from God because you don't set out to do it. And then you're like, wow, I didn't see it that way. It's unexpected. And then your creative work goes in a different direction. And it's like God
Definitely.
God flows through you in that different creative direction. And it's this
Yeah.
sense of communing with God in a very special way.
I'm curious, what are some ways that you've gathered along the ways to like care for your creative soul and that have also maybe had to do with your faith and strengthening your relationship with God? How do you see those intertwining and maybe helping each other out?
So I think there's always like three pillars of looking after yourself, sort of the physical, the spiritual, and then the psychological sides of things. And I think to really be in a good space for yourself and to be the best version of yourself for God and everyone around you, you've got to take care of those three facets of yourself. So for me, physically, it's really important for me to exercise. I find that that's part of my self-care. And then psychologically, like I know in my mind, sometimes I struggle with real anxious thoughts. I've found that it's good to be aware of those, what's happening in my brain, and spiritually also to pray and take time to spend time with God. But I think all those things kind of get incorporated into my writing imaginative
Mhm.
practice. I talked a bit about the fantasy aspect, and this sort of flows into what I'm feeling called to write for my next book. Is it's more fantasy based, but it's also
Mm.
based on sort of the psyche and finding different facets of yourself and drawing them in and accepting them to integrate your full self. I don't
Hmm.
know exactly where that's going to lead yet, and I'm like, really, God, do you really want me to write this? Because it sounds really out there. I did work on myself with a psychologist with a specific type of therapy called EMDR a lot. I
Mhm.
find that's like very creative.
Mhm.
I don't know if you're aware of what that is, but it involves a lot of imagination and thinking back to past experiences and then reintegrating them.
Mhm.
So I feel like that is sort of like a psychological, spiritual process, creative process that I think, I'll be reflecting on that in my new book. I'm using some
Mm.
things I learned through that process, just seeing things from different perspectives. And yeah, it's sort of about reclaiming true parts of yourself. And somehow I feel that's linked to nature and the Garden of Eden and the creator God. Whereas this first book that I wrote was obviously about Jesus. But the
Mm.
second book, I feel, focuses on a different aspect of the Trinity.
So interesting. Going back to kind of what you're saying about the different pillars of caring for yourself, I feel like that is so important and something that I've had to learn too as a creative because I think it's easy, especially I am a graphic designer, doing creative work, whether it is like professionally or just finding time to do it in your day to day life. It is something that you kind of have to cultivate energy to do. And I think that I notice when I'm not caring for myself in those different areas, I don't really have that sort of capacity and that sort of energy, I think, to create. And so I think that being able to be attentive to caring for your creative soul, knowing what you need on a regular basis, it's important to have that balance of physicality and mental health and your spiritual health. Like they're all interconnected. And I think that's something that I've learned is so important, and it kind of also connects with your relationship with God. I feel like you can grow all of those things together with the Lord. And I love what you're saying about your future book. I think that there's something so cool to explore there. And what I'm
I
hearing is this vision of like creativity helping you heal and bringing God into it. Is that something that you've found in your own life, like creativity to be able to help you bring out parts of yourself that you've forgotten or maybe just, healed from different things, like kind of that intersection of faith and healing and creativity? What has that played out for
yeah,
you?
I think a lot of it will be, drawn from my own experiences as using that method I talked about, where you think of fantastical situations in your head or past situations in your head and you reintegrate it differently.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, for some reason, I think that is also linked to nature, the creator God, the Old Testament. So I'm reading a lot about the Old Testament at the moment, and I actually find it really difficult to understand. I'm like, how did Jesus come up with his teaching out of this?
yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, so I actually find it really hard actually, but I'm reading commentary on it at the moment. That's part of what I'm doing to try to find what it is that God wants me to do with this next piece of writing. It's interesting because there's like different pieces, like there's like I've been drawn to different particular Bible verses. Like Isaiah 54 for me is one that I'm really drawn to a lot. And
Mhm,
then there are mentions of it in the Gospels. Apparently there's references to it in the Gospel of John, and then I'm
mm,
trying to just work this all out, but I'm like, "Oh, I'm much better with just the Gospels. I don't really get the Old Testament, to be honest." But the nature stuff is really interesting to me because,
mhm.
there's always this talk, I guess, self-care and stuff about nature being really healing. And there's so much nature imagery in the Old Testament. And that is interesting to me. But I also have
Mhm.
this thing with nature where I'm like, I don't really feel particularly comfortable with nature because there's lots of stuff in nature that's a bit scary and could kill me, especially living in Australia,
Oh,
as people
yeah.
have, yeah. So I have that sort of relationship with it. And then there's this sort of like the concept of Eden. And um, like I think like the the title of my book that I want to write is Falling Back to Eden. And it's like coming through
Mm.
all this fantastical sort of story way to fall back to your Eden, which is like fall back to be the integrated person, integrated particularly I think it's aimed at younger women, like young adult women and being your full self as an
Mm.
integrated version of
Mhm.
yourself. Yeah.
Mhm. Wow. I definitely resonate with that feeling of parts of the Old Testament being confusing, and yet I'm drawn to the imagery. Isaiah 35 specifically is a really special passage for me. I don't know if you've read it, but it talks about the wilderness will rejoice and blossom, and it's kind of something that's helped me through a season of spiritual wilderness that has really spawned a lot of my creativity, and I think there's something there with just a lot of the imagery of the Old Testament that has a lot of metaphors that you have to then unpack and explore, but when you are willing to, the Lord reveals really interesting things, and I feel like that is just a lot of the creative process of like diving into those mysteries and those metaphors, and when we have Jesus and we're welcoming him into it, like it's really cool to see kind of the revelations that he reveals that I never would have come to the conclusions with. So I'm really curious to continue to see what you create out of these ideas. And I really like that idea about coming back to our true selves, and I mean, it's a process, like, I'm in that process for sure, and maybe part of your demographic for this next book for sure, and I feel like it's a path that the Lord wants us to take, but sometimes we don't really have a clear path, so then we don't have a great sort of roadmap, and so
Mm.
perhaps this book could kinda help be a roadmap for some people, especially creatives, maybe have how to use our creativity and our desire to be our true selves to return to that
Yeah,
place
I
that
hope
God
so.
wants us to come from.
That sounds like a good plan. I still
Yeah.
don't know what God wants me to do with it. I'm like, this is really odd, but God's kind of odd. So, I'll just go with it.
I love that. I love your willingness to being just open to the process. I think that's really inspiring for people, and I feel like that's a lot of what the creative process with God is like, and then something he wants us all to lean into, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting how God communicates with us through our creativity in different ways, and everyone has different creative pursuits.
Mhm.
My husband likes to cook. I don't like to cook. That's not my creative pursuit. Works for me. Uh,
Yeah.
so, um, yeah, through hobbies and through artistic work and
Mhm.
through music and all sorts of things. And everyone's
Yeah.
different. Everyone's so different.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the diversity, and I think that's something I'm passionate about, helping other people, like, be like, "That is creative, like, what you're doing there is creative," and, like, tap into that, because I think we need more creativity, especially in the faith. I've just come from a background of a lot of diversity in the creative arts being expressed in the church, and so I really love when I'm seeing other creatives speaking about, like, "Hey, this is how I can incorporate my faith," or, "This is how God is revealing himself through creativity," because it gives encouragement for other people to explore that for themselves or read the work that you're creating. It brings a different flavor to the faith that I think is very experiential and what we're all craving. And so I think that artists and creatives really play a special role that I want everyone to continue to lean into.
Yeah, definitely. I like what you're doing, Haley, with your abiding creatives and focusing on the abiding side of creativity rather than the productive side. It makes it like a striving thing. And
Mhm.
that's not what it's there for, I don't think. It's about a way of being with God and communing with God.
Definitely. I'm curious if that has been something that you've wrestled with even in creating your book or even creating this new book, that feeling of wanting to perform, wanting to create, but also wanting to be with Jesus and to rest and not, like, get ahead of him in some ways, you know?
Yeah, I think with this one, God's being a little bit slower with me. I think He knows I've got a lot on my plate. So I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I don't really know where this is going. And maybe I'm just more into you now. I feel like with the
Mhm.
first one, I was, because I always knew I wanted to write a book. And I was like really frustrated, like, "Why haven't I done this yet?" Maybe this time I'm just a bit more relaxed about it and I'm
Mhm.
waiting for God's leading, and I think this is what God's calling me to do, but I have to just kind of
Mhm.
spend time and see where it goes. I have written one piece that is on my Substack that I wrote even before the Pilot's Wife piece, I think, and it was a
Mm,
fantasy piece, and it's about this young woman that's in like this forest place. There's something about fantasy always being in forests, and I don't
mhm.
don't know that. I think that has to do with the whole concept of Eden and nature and stuff as well.
Mhm.
And then she re-encounters like the feminine essence of herself in a different being that's actually a mermaid. So yeah, that's on my Substack. It's kind of odd. I guess it's like a fable type of
Mm,
fantasy piece.
mhm.
Mm.
Wow. I'm gonna have to go read that. Was that something that you also kind of used, like, your imagination to create?
Yeah, yep, definitely. And actually, that came out of I've got my analysis of it. This was another assessment piece I did. It was a different subject. It was, what was it called? Short stories, writers and readers, or something.
Mm,
And there is the analysis of it on my Substack as well, and I talk about
mhm.
that. It actually came out of the dream retreat that I went on, where we talked about dreams,
Ah,
and
yeah.
mermaids are like a mythological creature, um, that have certain meanings for people.
Hmm.
But there's all these things in dreams that mean different things, and apparently a lot
Mhm.
of the time, like, things like animals in dreams can mean different energies, not necessarily like a
Interesting.
different character. I don't
Mhm.
know how true it is. Obviously, it's different for everybody. Every
Mhm.
person's dreams don't really make sense. So
Mhm.
most of the time, yeah, my thing is like this young female is reclaiming herself after loss, and she has this journey through this forest place and encounters different versions of herself and then invites them back into being a part of her. And through that process, she is healed and she becomes fully her. And then she finds her way back to her Eden.
That's so cool. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to go read that. I was just thinking there's something about, I think, fantasy, it's so layered that you can weave such, like, meanings into it that you can in other, like, forms of writing, and I think there's something really special about that you can really utilize to then kind of share whatever deeper messages you want to share, so I'm very curious about that.
It's like parables, right? The parables that
Mhm.
Jesus used are
Yeah.
very layered. It's a form of fantasy.
Mhm.
Some of them aren't fantastical, like, they don't have
Mhm.
mythological creatures in them, but,
Yeah.
it's a form of fantasy, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I like that way of thinking of it, like, storytelling. I think I'm so used to being on the side of nonfiction writing or, like, I guess poetry that's definitely has all the layers to it too,
Mm,
but there's something really special about fantasy and fiction that even intertwined with faith can really have a different flavor and speak something deeper to us all that you don't get from other forms of writing.
mm. Yeah, definitely.
Well, this has been so great chatting with you, Katie. Thank you so much for all that you've shared. I have one more question. Is there any advice that you have for creatives and writers out there?
I would say lean into your creative pursuit, but don't focus on the output. Focus on being with God while you do your creative work and listening and attuning yourself to God through the process. It's about the process and abiding rather than the producing. That's important, and you'll probably learn more through the process about yourself. In some ways, it's more important what you learn through the process than the end product and how that's going to touch other people. The end product will touch people in God's way if you abide with God in the creative process.
Oh, so well said, and that's something I wanna keep leaning into, I think we all want to, so thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can we find you on the internet? I will link all the links, but please share wherever you like to share your work.
I'm on Substack. That's the best place to find me, Katie
Amazing.
Sampias on
Mhm,
Substack.
mhm.
I'm surfing white waves on Instagram. And my book, Her Story of Jesus, is available on all good platforms where you can purchase books, including Amazon. You can buy it from Calipress in America directly, and Barnes and Noble in Australia. It's on Booktopia in the Nile as well as Amazon. So yeah, it'd be great if people bought my book and let me know what you think about it. And I like connecting with people that have similar creative journey. I always get so much from it.
So good, yes. such a talented writer and you just have so much wisdom. So I'm so glad that you got to come on, and definitely go read the book. It's amazing. And stay tuned also for your next book because it sounds wonderful too. So
Thanks,
thank you so
Haley.
much, Katie. Wow, that was such a good conversation with Katie. I love what she had to say about using imagination and connecting with Jesus through our creativity. And I'm curious to hear what stirred in you as she was speaking about her creative process. So please share in the comments and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.